Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. I think it's fair to say that the Warhammer hobby is jam-packed with its fair share of mysteries and theories. Frankly, with libraries of books and lore having been released over the decades, there's a lot to fuel even the wildest of speculation. However, there's arguably one mystery that has fueled more debate and speculation than any other, and it's a rather simple one. Was Sigmar actually a lost Primarch? No, don't worry, I'm not jumping into that one today, but I do want to touch on the topic of the Lost Legions of Warhammer 40k, or 30k I guess, and the mystery surrounding their fate. More specifically, I want to go into some of the vague history of the 30k timeline, including some of the recent revelations from the Horus Heresy book series, and suggest one theory of my own, that they have not only remained loyalists, but they may also still be in active service. Now, I should say that of course this is wild speculation of my own, but looking at the lore that I'm going to take you through today, I do think it's a fun concept that isn't completely improbable, and it's a view that I've not seen much talk of elsewhere. That said, for those who are unfamiliar with the Lost Legions, let me offer a brief summary of who they are. In the era of Warhammer 30k, the Emperor of Mankind has created 20 legions of Space Marines, each led by a genetic sire called a Primarch. These Primarchs, who include characters like Rabute Guilliman, Magnus and Mortarion, not only lead these mighty legions, but serve as the adoptive sons of the Emperor himself, which is really where a lot of the problems at the time stem from. Side note, the Emperor isn't such a great dad. However, during the era of the Horus Heresy, when the Primarch Horus turned on the Emperor, only 18 of the 20 legions were in service. The other two, the 2nd and the 11th legions, had not only ceased operating, but had been expunged from all Imperial records. It's said that they committed crimes of such a magnitude that the Emperor himself decreed them to be exterminated and expunged from all record and memory. As such, they are considered lost legions, and as you may have guessed, almost nothing is known about them either in the lore or outside of it. And to a large extent that is deliberate. GW originally wanted the Lost Legions to serve as a way for players to create their own custom Space Marine and Chaos Space Marine forces that didn't then have to adopt the traditions and patrons of other well-known legions. However, as the Horus Heresy has become an increasingly popular tabletop IP and a titanic series for Black Library, the vagaries have started to give way to interesting insights. Through the Black Library books, for example, we get to see how the Primarchs view their lost brothers and what they know and don't know about them following their supposed eradication. So in this video I want to point to what we do know either in the lore or through revelations in the Horus Heresy series, and offer my reasoning for why the Lost Legions and their Primarchs may not actually have suffered as we believe, and may in fact be serving the Imperium in ways none may expect. To start, however, I want to ask you a question. What is truth in an empire like the Imperium of Man? Even in the era of the Great Crusade, the Imperium, behind its veneer of enlightenment and humanitarian unity, was still a rather authoritarian regime, cloaked in secrecy and strict doctrine. For example, while the forces of the Imperium were reconquering entire systems during the Horus-led part of the Great Crusade, the Emperor himself was working on his secret webway project. Once completed, it would have enabled humanity to cross the stars without the need of an Imperial navy, and fearing rebellion from those military forces, the Emperor kept it secret from everyone, even his own sons. You may also recall the account of the Destruction of Menarchia in the first Heretic novel. In short, Lorgar and his word-bearers, believing the Emperor to be a divine being, built a great city, a perfect city as they called it, in dedication to him and that doctrine. However, the Emperor considered it a threat to his own secular imperial truth, and with the aid of the Ultramarines, razed Menarchia to the ground, all while compelling the word-bearers to kneel before them in forgiveness. Now, however the books may choose to moralise these moments, and the countless others in the Horus Heresy series as a whole, I want to point out one thing. Truth is a very guarded currency in the Imperium, and the Emperor and his closest circle will pay practically any price to keep it that way. So how does any of this link to the Lost Legions? Well, again in the Horus Heresy series we get some great insights into the Primarch's own emotions and reflections regarding their brothers' fates. In the book Fear to Tread, for example, Horus asked Sanguinius why he did not seek the Emperor's help in curing the Blood Angels of the curse of the Red Thirst. "But why have you kept this from our father? If any living being could know the key to it, it would be him." Sanguinius rounded on Horus, his seraphic features hardening. "You know the reason," he answered with a snarl. "I will not be responsible for the erasure of the Blood Angels from Imperial history. I will not have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the Hegemon as my legion's only memorial." And in Vulcan Lives, we hear a similar response from the Primarch of the Salamanders when he is asked if he should report concerns about Comrade Kurz, Primarch of the Night Lords, to Horus or Rogel Dawn. "I am troubled, Artellus, very much so. None of us wants another sanction, another empty pillar in the great investory, another brother's name excised from all record. It is shame enough to bear the grief for two. I have no wish to add to it, but what choice do I have? Clearly the emotion stemming from the lost Primarchs remains exceptionally vivid for their remaining brothers, but it's really the only thing that is vivid about them. You'll note from the two excerpts that their statues on Terra have been removed as per the Edict of Obliteration, forever condemning their memory from history. But it's not just their statues that have been forgotten. In the short story The Chamber at the End of Memory, set just prior to the Siege of Terra, Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, wanders the depths of the Imperial Palace and discovers two rooms belonging to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, both of which Dorn remembers previously being in another part of the palace. What follows is a fascinating conversation between Rogel Dorn and the Emperor's Sigillite Malcador, in which the latter asks Dorn to try and recall any memory of his brothers. "Have you ever wondered why none speak of them?" the Sigillite replied. Of course, there is the censure over all who know of the lost never to talk openly of their existence. Still, in the absence of fact, all men will speculate. But you do not. The Primarchs never speak of their lost kinsmen in anything but the vaguest of terms. Have you ever wondered why that is? As you said, we are forbidden to do so. Even when you are beyond your father's sight. Even when no one would be aware of such a discussion. Ask yourself why your thoughts always slip over recall of the lost and pass by. Malcador bowed his head. What were they called, Rogel? The Sigillite seemed almost sorrowful as he asked him. Your vanished brethren, tell me their names and their titles. Dorn tried to grasp that vague recollection, tried to frame the questions that gnawed at him, but once more his perfect eidetic recall failed him. He could only see the phantoms of those moments. Holding on to them was like trying to capture smoke between his fingers. Their names were... His mighty voice faltered. His brow creased in frustration. They were... To his horror, Dorn realised that he did not know. The awareness was there, he could almost see the shape of the knowledge out on the far horizon of his thoughts, but it retreated from his every effort to see it clearly. Each time he attempted to frame a memory of the lost, it was like fighting a tidal wave. Everything else is clear, but they are ghosts in my mind. Later, we discover the reason for Dorn's loss of memory. Malcador slowly moved back out of the ornate sword's killing arc. The loss of the 2nd and the 11th was such a wound upon us, and it threatened the ideals at the heart of the Great Crusade. It would have ruined all that we had built in the drive to reunite humanity and drive off our enemies. Steps had to be taken. He met Dorn's hard gaze. The legionaries they left behind, leaderless and forsaken, they were too great a resource to be discarded out of hand. They did not share the fate of their fathers. You and Rabute argued in their favour, but you do not recall it. Malcador nodded to himself. It fell to me to see that they were attuned to new circumstances. You robbed them of their memories. I granted them a mercy, Malcador replied, his tone wounded. A second chance. What mercy is there in a lie? Dorn thundered. It's rather incredible that so few lines contain such seismic revelations for the 30k universe. Rogel Dorn, along with Guilliman, not only oversaw the indoctrination of the 2nd and 11th Legions into the Ultramarines, but also agreed that they and their fellow Primarchs should have their memories shrouded, all to protect a truth that was considered fatal to the Great Crusade. And while it's a compelling concept, I don't actually believe it, and I want to explain why. First, it seems odd that after agreeing to conceal the reasons for the loss of the two Primarchs, they would still allow any memory of them to exist at all. The two empty plinths, for example, still serve as a faint reminder of what once was. Similarly, many Legionnaires are aware of the steps the Emperor took in condemning the 2nd and 11th Legions, as we discover in books like Angron when Lork, a World Eater Dreadnought, says to another Legionnaire, "Twice before the Emperor has purged his own progeny and every living soul within the legions that followed them." Now, not only is that false, many of the Legionnaires clearly survived, but you would think that any idle speculation, however factless, would also serve to undermine the Great Crusade and the unity of humanity. So why is any of it permitted when we know the Emperor could have simply silenced any who had been involved? And then there's the fact that Leman Russ is known as the Emperor's executioner, and that his Space Wolves took a deciding role in the sanction of the two lost legions. We hear as much in a conversation that Russ has back in the book Prospero Burns. The unprecedented, like Astartes fighting Astartes, like the rout being called to sanction another legion. That, he answers. He laughs, but it is a sad sound. Hjalda, no, that's not unprecedented. Interestingly, this conversation takes place specifically after the Emperor orders Russ to bring the World Eaters to heel following the Genna massacres, and we know that later he carries out the role of executioner in conflict with the Thousand Sons. This all begs the question of, if Rogel Dorn cannot remember anything about his brothers, what exactly does Leman Russ recall? In all honesty, while Malcador may be telling the truth, it seems a little too unconvincing for me. It's either an oddly half-hearted cover-up given the threat it supposedly poses, or it rests on a truth that Dorn himself can never verify. Furthermore, as we see, Malcador's account plays perfectly to Dorn's stoic objective way of analysing situations, a potential Achilles heel that Malcador may have exploited in this instance. There's also the language Malcador uses, which points to a lot more going on than he's telling Dorn. For example, the way Malcador hesitates before the word loss. It's almost like he's struggling to find the words, and implies that the words themselves don't quite convey the full truth of the matter. It's clearly a deliberate inclusion by the author James Swallow, and something that I think we're meant to notice. In fact, Malcador also refers to the Lost Primarchs as your vanished brethren, which suggests that the Lost Primarchs were not killed as such during their censure, but may have been lost in a far truer sense of the word. Now, it could be, as many suggest, that both Primarchs are in fact held in captivity under the Imperial Palace, maybe in these two rooms. However, in the short story, they are only guarded by psychic wards, which one of Dorn's librarians is able to navigate without meeting any insurmountable obstacles, unless you count Malcador, who, while formidable, is probably a bit busy to be their sole jailer. What I mean to suggest is that Dorn clearly finds something that he shouldn't have all too easy given the circumstances, and that doesn't make sense if both Primarchs' fate is such a guarded secret. I also suspect that there's a little bit of theatre happening here, orchestrated by Malcador on behalf of the Emperor, and Dorn is allowed to think that he forces a truth from Malcador in the end. In fact, even after Malcador shows him the supposed breathtaking truth behind the Lost Primarch's secrecy, Dorn still questions it. There was still much that the Psyker had said and done which the Imperial Fist did not accept, and although Malcador had professed to have been truthful with him, Dorn had doubts that would never ebb. Again, in the highest echelons of the Imperium, truth is clearly a guarded currency, even in the most testing of times. But enough of this deep analysis, I think you see my point. Malcador's story doesn't add up, and it's almost too convenient given the perceived threat and the actual circumstances. So, and here's the question, what other possible fate might have befallen the Lost Primarchs, and how might that fate align with what we know and hear in the lore? Well, to answer that, we need to turn to one of the few campaigns that we actually know both the 2nd and the 11th Legions participated in, the Rangdan Xenocides. To offer a brief summary of a rather concealed conflict in the Imperium's history, by around the mid-800s of the 30th millennium, the Great Crusade was already moving into the eastern fringes of the galaxy, seeking to reconquer its systems and reunite with lost pockets of humanity's old empire. However, almost as soon as they started to breach those systems, they came under attack from a race known as the Rangdan. Now, not much is known about the Rangdan themselves, except for the fact that they seem to have two castes of warrior, Cerephors and Osivores, and their ships were seen to mirror Earth's jellyfish thanks to their organic structures and flailing tendrils. However, while appearing somewhat technologically inferior to the Imperium, the damage they inflicted on humanity was horrifying. Systems seized early in the campaign by the human expeditionary forces quickly fell to the Rangdan's counter-advance, and entire fleets were obliterated alongside tens of thousands of soldiers and heavy vehicles from both the Imperialis Auxilia and Mechanicum. In short, the Imperium was buckling, so much so that at least 6 Astartes legions, including the 2nd and 11th, alongside numerous Titan legions and additional fleets, were brought up to hold off the Xenos forces. Even then, it wasn't enough. The Astartes were brutalised, particularly the Dark Angels, and entire legion cohorts were wiped out with barely any noticeable gains. Finally, the Emperor himself intervened, and after using forgotten technology taken from the Labyrinth of Night under Mars, the Rangdan threat was at last stopped. Over time, almost half a century to be precise, the Imperium launched a campaign to purge the Rangdan from every system in the Eastern Fringe, eventually overcoming the race and staving off a crushing defeat for the Imperium. Now, before we get into the details, let's just make the obvious point. The Rangdan Xenocides mark a point when the Imperium was on the cusp of being overwhelmed. Without the Emperor's direct intervention, it likely would have lost. You could argue that more forces could have been called up, including other legions, but that would have put the entire Great Crusade in jeopardy, and regardless, it may not have guaranteed victory. However, as it stood, humanity's supremacy in the galaxy had been tested and put into question, and I'm sure the Emperor himself must have been considering the consequences if he had not intervened. And for context, this was before Ullanor. Rather than being a unified Orc race, the Rangdan were an unknown threat that should have been simple for the Imperium to overcome. Instead, they had significantly mauled the Astartes legions and taken several Titan legions and hundreds of thousands of troops with them to oblivion. Even worse, there was a discovery about the Rangdan that suggested that the Slorgth, one of the vilest and most sinister races to haunt the galaxy, had directed the Rangdan using a form of hive mind. So with all this in mind, imagine for a moment what the Emperor and some of his closest confidants might have been thinking at this point. The Emperor for one would have, unbeknownst to many, been planning to hand over the reins of the Great Crusade to one of his sons, allowing him to return to Terra to work on the secret Webway project. And as Magnus discovered all too well, he wasn't someone you could get in touch with easily when he did finally get to it. And looking at the devastation the Rangdan had carried out and their possible connection to the Slorgth, it would have become clear that many powerful threats were awaiting the Imperium in the distant corners of the galaxy, threats that not only posed an obstacle to the Great Crusade, but also a mortal threat. That threat was not only militaristic, but also ideological. The Imperium's Great Crusade rested on the idea of humanity being the supreme race in the galaxy. Under the Emperor's might and wisdom, humanity was reaching for its rightful place in the stars and reclaiming its own empire as its birthright. All of that would start to fall apart when confronted by the fact that the Imperium was seemingly not the supreme force it claimed to be. Without the Emperor, it could barely hold its ground against threats like the Rangdan. Under those conditions, I think it's safe to suggest that the Emperor might have thought long and hard about how the Imperium could manage those unknown threats in his absence. There were certainly other powerful Xenos races out there, and the Imperium couldn't afford a major defeat during such a pivotal period in its history, lest humanity begin to doubt its wider goals and aims. Remember, at this point, the Horus Heresy wasn't even conceivable to the Emperor. However, once his Webway project was complete, a threat like the Rangdan could easily be overwhelmed by the fact the Imperium could then move its forces from one end of the galaxy to the other in a fraction of the time. Even with their ferocious might, the Rangdan would have struggled if all 20 legions and the Emperor turned up suddenly to hammer some sense into them. In that respect, what the Emperor needed most wasn't new technologies or more military forces. He simply needed time to stave off the major threats while he then finished the Webway project, which he would then start to do after the Battle of Ullanor 110 years later, a very short span of time in 30k's history. And here's my theory. Could the 2nd and 11th Legions have been tasked with intercepting these unknown threats beyond the Imperium's borders? As Astartes, they were far better placed to survive such a hostile environment and live long enough to either overcome those threats, hold them off, and or share valuable intel with the Emperor's inner circle, giving them time to muster forces and react while the Emperor finished his work secretly. Now, I'm sure some of you may be raising an eyebrow at this point, but let me point to some other evidence that supports my theory. Firstly, the timeline. We know that the Rangdan xenocides finished around the year 890 in Millennium 30. However, the quote I mentioned earlier from Prospero Burns, where Russ talks about how Astartes fighting Astartes is not unprecedented, happens just a few decades later, following the Genna massacre by the World Eaters. So in such a short space of time, the 2nd and 11th Legions go from actively serving the Imperium in a mortal conflict to being almost distant memories. Whatever happened must have happened very shortly after the Xenocides, and it makes sense to think that the two are somewhat connected. Secondly, when the Astartes legions were being formed, it was common for them to be established as Proto-Legions. These were much smaller in size to normal legions, a few thousand warriors in total, and used to battle test them while further groups of recruits and Geneseed were prepared. Interestingly, we learn in the third Warhammer 30k rulebook Extermination that this process failed for a redacted legion or legions, suggesting that either the 2nd or the 11th, maybe both, were not fully sized when they served. Conversely, we know from Malcador's claim that many of the surviving legionnaires of the two lost legions were given a second chance and used to swell the ranks of the Ultramarines. As a side note, the Ultramarines are the 13th Legion, and given that 2 plus 11 is 13, I wonder if that in itself points to either a grand master plan or some lazy choices by Malcador. In any case, could the two legions have actually been streamlined at this point to allow them to operate more effectively in the Void, requiring less resources and being more agile, particularly useful given they didn't know what they might be facing, all while preserving some of their strength within the other legions? I suspect so, again pointing to the twisted truth behind Malcador's words. And finally, it's worth pointing out that the Alpha Legion, who you may expect would be perfect for this reconnaissance role, had not yet been reunited with their Primarch. In fact, Alpharius would not be discovered by the Emperor for another 80 years after the Xenocides. As such, I can imagine the Emperor didn't want to send the Alpha Legion, since the truth and success of this mission could only really be left to one of his own sons. Now, that's what the timeline might suggest, but let's also turn back to Malcador's words. He claims to Dawn that the loss of the legions was such a wound on the Imperium that it threatened the ideals of the Great Crusade itself. It would have ruined everything they had fought for, and as such, steps needed to be taken. Again, as I mentioned earlier, imagine the reaction of trillions of Imperial citizens and soldiers if the Astartes and Imperial forces had completely buckled under the Rangdan, if Primarchs had died and the Eastern Fringe became a full-scale retreat while the remaining forces were mustered. You can imagine not only the panic and fear, but potentially the loss of faith in the Imperium and its leaders' ability to foresee and overcome such challenges. I think that was the wound Malcador was referring to, the doubt the Emperor and Malcador must have had in their forces while contemplating another Rangdan Xenocide in his absence. If it were to happen again, it may well have torn the Imperium apart in a way just like the Horus Heresy did. Again, Horus's betrayal was inconceivable at the time. Again, it's hard to grasp anything Malcador says with any certainty, but there's so much suggestion for double meaning here, in the pauses, the vagueness of the language, and what we already know about him, notably his unflinchable conviction in the Emperor, his vision, and the measures he takes to keep the two alive. So while there are many theories about the Lost Legions, all of which are valid given that we know so little about them, I sense my own theory can stand some ground in light of everything I've mentioned. In the face of an unknown dire threat, the Emperor and Malcador tasked two of their smallest legions with scouting ahead to find out what was waiting for them. To that end, they shed many of their forces to the Ultramarines and concealed all information about the Rangdan and their own existence behind Imperial censure. And most importantly of all, to ensure the mission was never dwelled upon by the Primarchs, lest doubt about the Imperium and the Emperor creep into their mind. After all, Horus showed us what doubt can do to a Primarch. Malcador wiped the memories of all of the Emperor's sons and concealed them behind the painful concocted story of their censure. You can almost imagine a meeting between the two lost Primarchs, the Emperor and Malcador, as they laid out this secret plan, and the resolution both Primarchs must have shown in understanding that they were going to fight the most dire war in the galaxy against threats that were not only a match for the Imperium, but stronger, and no one would know why, or at what cost, except the other. It's with that picture in mind that I'll turn to Dawn's closing thoughts following his conversation with Malcador, and his thoughts about what Malcador had shown him in a vision depicting the apparent true fate of the two lost Primarchs. There was still much that the Psyker had said and done which the Imperial Fist did not accept, and although Malcador had professed to have been truthful with him, Dawn had doubts that would never ebb. But not in this matter. In this he was certain. The lost were gone, and it was well that they were. The grand misfortunes that befell them crumbled in Dawn's mind, but they left behind certainty. What came to pass could overshadow everything. Dawn knew that now. The raw, hateful truth is clear to me. If they were here with us now, this war would already have been lost. So, that's my theory on the Lost Legions. Again, it's just speculation based on what I've seen in the timeline and in the Horus Heresy series, and to be blunt, I kind of never want it to be proven true. As I said at the start, the mystery of the Lost Legions is the fuel of so much entertainment and engagement in our hobby. It's a compelling mystery, and I think many would be disappointed to have it resolved one way or the other. I know I would be. But in that spirit, what do you think happened to the Lost Primarchs and their legions? I know there's plenty of talk out there, so feel free to come up with your own theory or share a link to one that you've read and that you found particularly interesting. In the meantime, I want to say a big thank you for watching today. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider liking it and subscribing to my channel, and I hope you'll join me for my next one. Also, let me know what future topics you might like me to cover in future. I'm always open to suggestions. Until that next video, however, do take care.